When avoidant realizes they broke your heart, it rarely happens during the argument, during the breakup, or even during the moment they walk away. The realization usually arrives much later, quietly, almost cruelly, when there is no longer anything left to distract them from the truth. It happens in the ordinary moments nobody talks about. A random evening, an empty room, a familiar song, a memory they weren't trying to revisit. Suddenly the story they spent months telling themselves begins to crack, and through those cracks comes a realization they never expected to face. Someone who genuinely loved them got hurt because of them. Not because of bad intentions, not because they wanted to cause pain, but because their fear, distance, and emotional walls left damage behind. If you've ever wondered whether an avoidant eventually understands the heartbreak they caused, this video is for you. And if you're someone fascinated by the hidden psychology of love, attachment, and human behavior, take a second to subscribe. There is something almost ironic about the avoidant journey. The very emotions they spend so much energy avoiding often become the emotions they are eventually forced to confront. And when that confrontation finally happens, it can change everything. The moment they finally see the damage is rarely dramatic. Most people imagine a sudden epiphany where everything becomes clear at once. In reality, it is usually a slow and uncomfortable awakening. At first, they only notice an absence. The messages are gone. The reassurance is gone. The person who used to wait, understand, forgive, and stay is no longer standing in the same place emotionally. What makes this realization so powerful is that avoidants often focus on maintaining distance when things feel overwhelming. They are busy protecting their independence, protecting their space, protecting themselves from vulnerability. During that process, they are rarely focused on the emotional experience of the other person. Their attention is directed inward toward relief, escape, and self-preservation. But once enough time passes, something changes. The emotional fog begins to lift. The immediate pressure disappears, and when they finally look back, they are no longer looking through the lens of defense. They are looking through the lens of hindsight. That is when they begin noticing things they could not see before. The tears they dismissed, the conversations they avoided, the affection they withheld, the confusion they left unanswered, and perhaps most painfully, the realization that someone was hurting while still trying to love them. For many avoidants, this is the first time they truly understand the emotional cost of their actions. The reason they often fail to see it while it is happening has little to do with cruelty and everything to do with emotional self-protection. Avoidant individuals tend to experience intimacy differently than others. When emotional closeness increases, their nervous system can interpret connection as pressure. Love begins to feel demanding. Expectations begin to feel threatening. Vulnerability begins to feel unsafe. As a result, their mind automatically shifts into protective mode. Instead of focusing on what their partner is feeling, they focus on reducing their own discomfort. This is why they may withdraw after moments of closeness, why they become distant during emotionally important conversations, why they sometimes appear indifferent when their partner is clearly hurting. From the outside, it can feel heartless, but internally, they are often overwhelmed by emotions they do not fully understand how to process. Their attention narrows. Their empathy becomes buried beneath self-protection. They are not asking, how much pain is this causing? They are asking, how do I stop feeling trapped? And because survival becomes the priority, awareness of the other person's heartbreak gets pushed into the background. The tragedy is that what feels like relief for them often feels like rejection for the person who loves them. To make that discomfort easier to live with, avoidants often create explanations that protect them from guilt. These stories are rarely conscious lies. They are psychological shields. They tell themselves the relationship wasn't that serious. They convince themselves their partner was too emotional, too needy, too demanding. They focus on every flaw, every conflict, every frustration. Their mind becomes an expert at finding reasons why distance is necessary. Because if distance is necessary, then the pain caused by that distance becomes easier to justify. If they can convince themselves they had no choice, they don't have to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that someone was deeply wounded by their actions. For a while, these stories work. They create emotional distance from accountability. They allow the avoidant to move forward without confronting the full weight of what happened. But stories have limits, especially when reality begins presenting evidence that contradicts them. Eventually, the image of the overly demanding partner starts colliding with memories of genuine care. The image of the bad relationship starts colliding with memories of laughter, loyalty, patience, and love. The mental protection that once felt solid begins falling apart. And when it does, the truth starts emerging in ways that are impossible to ignore. That is when the silence begins talking. At first, silence feels comforting. There are no difficult conversations, no emotional expectations, No pressure to explain feelings. The avoidant finally has the space they thought they wanted. But something strange often happens when enough time passes. The silence that once felt peaceful begins echoing. Without constant distractions, old memories become louder. Moments they pushed aside start resurfacing. Small details return unexpectedly. A look they once ignored. A message they never answered. A vulnerable confession they brushed past. The mind has a way of revisiting unfinished emotional business, and silence creates the perfect environment for that process to begin. What makes this stage so difficult is that there is nobody left to argue with, nobody left to blame, nobody left to convince. The avoidant is alone with their own memories, alone with their own choices, alone with questions they may have spent months avoiding, and for the first time, instead of seeing the relationship through the lens of discomfort, they begin seeing it through the lens of loss. That shift changes everything. As those memories become more frequent, they start replaying the relationship itself. Not just the ending, but the entire emotional journey. Conversations that once seemed insignificant suddenly feel important. Missed opportunities become painfully obvious. They remember moments when someone reached for connection and received distance instead. They remember affection they struggled to return. They remember kindness they assumed would always be there. What is fascinating is that avoidants often gain emotional clarity after the relationship is no longer active. When the threat of intimacy disappears, their ability to reflect sometimes increases dramatically. They begin seeing patterns that were invisible before. They notice how often someone tried to understand them, how many chances they were given, how much patience was extended toward them. And with every replayed memory comes a growing awareness that the heartbreak wasn't created by one dramatic event. It was built slowly through emotional absence, unanswered needs, and walls that never came down. The more they revisit the relationship, the harder it becomes to escape that conclusion. And for many avoidants, this is the beginning of a realization that will follow them far longer than they ever expected. And somewhere inside that growing awareness, the first signs of regret begin to appear. Not always in dramatic ways, not always through tears or desperate attempts to reconnect. Sometimes regret starts as a quiet discomfort that refuses to leave. A feeling that something important was mishandled. A sense that a chapter ended with words left unsaid. The avoidant may try to dismiss it at first, convincing themselves they are simply feeling lonely or nostalgic. But genuine regret feels different from loneliness. Loneliness focuses on what is missing in the present. Regret focuses on what happened in the past. It keeps directing attention back towards specific choices, specific moments, specific opportunities that can never be relived exactly the same way again. This is where many avoidants begin experiencing an unfamiliar emotional burden. For so long, distance felt like the solution. Now distance becomes the thing that hurts. They begin wondering whether certain conversations should have gone differently, whether they should have stayed present instead of shutting down, whether they should have listened instead of withdrawing. These questions do not arrive all at once. They arrive gradually, returning over and over until they can no longer be ignored. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part is realizing that the pain they are feeling now is connected to pain someone else felt much earlier. They are arriving emotionally at a place their partner had already visited long ago. As this process deepens, another realization starts taking shape, one that often catches them completely off guard. They begin recognizing how much they were actually loved. During the relationship, that love may have felt ordinary, predictable, constant, almost invisible because it was always there. Human beings have a tendency to overlook what remains available. We become accustomed to loyalty, we become accustomed to patience, we become accustomed to someone's efforts to understand us. And avoidants are particularly vulnerable to this blindness because their attention is often focused on what feels uncomfortable rather than what feels supportive. But once the relationship exists only in memory, perspective changes. Suddenly they start noticing things they never appreciated fully when they were happening. The late-night conversations where someone stayed present despite feeling hurt, the emotional reassurance that was offered repeatedly, the willingness to work through conflict instead of abandoning the connection. They begin seeing how much emotional labor another person invested just to keep the relationship alive. And what makes this realization so painful is understanding that much of that effort was given freely. Not because it was owed, not because it was guaranteed, but because someone genuinely cared. The avoidant starts recognizing that they were loved in ways they may never have fully acknowledged. And once that realization settles in, it becomes difficult to view the past through the same defensive lens they once used. Then comes one of the most powerful turning points of all, the shock of seeing you pull away. For a long time, the avoidant may have unconsciously assumed that your emotional availability would remain constant, not because they wanted to take advantage of it, but because it became part of the emotional landscape they relied upon without fully recognizing its value. They became used to your attempts to reconnect, used to your patience, used to your willingness to understand. But eventually, every person reaches a point where protecting their own heart becomes necessary. The day you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop trying to force understanding, something changes. The energy shifts. And often that shift speaks louder than any argument ever could. Arguments can be dismissed, emotional discussions can be avoided, but genuine emotional detachment is different. It cannot be debated away. It cannot be negotiated with. It simply exists. The avoidant suddenly realizes that the person who once fought for the relationship is no longer fighting. The person who once waited is no longer waiting. The person who once offered endless opportunities for repair is no longer offering them. This realization can feel profoundly destabilizing because it confronts them with something they never truly expected, the possibility that they have actually lost someone. Not temporarily, not symbolically, but genuinely. And sometimes that awareness arrives only after the door they assumed would remain open has quietly closed. What follows is often a period where their usual defenses begin losing their effectiveness. For years, emotional distance may have served as a reliable coping mechanism. Whenever vulnerability felt overwhelming, they could withdraw. Whenever guilt appeared, they could rationalize. Whenever intimacy felt threatening, they could create space. But certain emotional realities cannot be managed forever through avoidance. Eventually, unresolved feelings begin finding their way through the cracks. The distractions stop working as well, the explanations stop feeling convincing. The emotional walls that once provided relief start feeling more like prisons than protection. This stage is deeply uncomfortable because the avoidant is being asked to confront emotions they spent a lifetime minimizing. Sadness becomes harder to suppress. Guilt becomes harder to escape. Self-reflection becomes unavoidable. They may find themselves thinking about the relationship during moments they least expect. They may experience sudden waves of emotion triggered by memories they thought they had moved beyond, and perhaps for the first time, they begin understanding that avoiding emotions does not eliminate them. It only postpones them. The feelings eventually return, often stronger than before, carrying years of accumulated meaning. This is why the realization of heartbreak can hit so hard. It is not just about one relationship. It is about confronting an entire pattern of emotional self-protection and finally seeing its consequences clearly. Within that emotional reckoning lives another burden that many avoidants carry silently: the weight of unspoken apologies. Contrary to popular belief, not every avoidant who feels regret immediately reaches out. In fact, many never do. Not because they feel nothing, but because accountability requires vulnerability, and vulnerability remains one of their deepest struggles. They may rehearse apologies privately, they may imagine conversations that never happen. They may think about what they would say if they had the courage to express everything honestly. Sometimes these imagined conversations become surprisingly detailed. They picture acknowledging the hurt they caused. They picture admitting they were wrong. They picture explaining fears they never revealed. Yet despite these internal dialogues, their words often remain trapped inside. Shame becomes a barrier. Pride becomes a barrier. Fear of rejection becomes a barrier. They worry that reaching out will reopen wounds. They worry they are too late. They worry they no longer deserve to be heard, and so the apology stays unspoken, carried quietly through months or even years. What makes this especially tragic is that the apology is often genuine. The understanding is often real. But emotional growth and emotional expression are not always the same thing. A person can finally understand the damage they caused and still struggle to communicate that understanding outwardly. And as these silent apologies accumulate, the avoidant begins learning one of life's most difficult lessons. Some words become heavier the longer they remain unsaid. The realization that they broke your heart is no longer a distant concept. It has become personal, undeniable, and impossible to completely escape. But something even more complex begins to surface once regret settles in. And it's the realization that missing someone and understanding their pain are not the same thing at all. At first, the avoidant may confuse the two. They might assume that because they think about you, because they feel the absence, because they occasionally feel that familiar emotional pull toward what once was, that this is enough to mean they truly understand what happened. But emotional absence creates a different kind of reflection than emotional awareness. Missing someone is centered around self-experience. It is about what they lost. It is about the space that feels empty now. It is about the comfort, connection, and familiarity that no longer exists in their present life. But understanding your pain requires something far more difficult. It requires stepping outside of their own emotional center and fully recognizing what it felt like on your side of the connection. The waiting, the confusion, the moments of self-doubt, the quiet questioning of whether they cared at all. This shift is uncomfortable because it removes the avoidant from the safety of their internal world and forces them to confront a reality where their actions had emotional consequences beyond their intention. And in that space, they begin to realize that what they are feeling is not the full picture. It is only one half of the story. The other half belonged to you, and it carried a different kind of weight entirely. And once that awareness starts forming, another truth becomes unavoidable. Some consequences cannot be undone simply because they are finally understood. This is where the emotional journey becomes heavier. Avoidants often operate under an unconscious belief that clarity can repair damage, that once they get it, once they finally understand what went wrong, something can still be fixed. But emotional experiences don't reset just because understanding arrives late. The other person's nervous system has already adapted to the absence. Their trust has already been reshaped by inconsistency. Their expectations have already changed. The emotional reality has moved forward without them. And this is where regret becomes painful in a new way, because understanding no longer carries the same power it would have had earlier in the story. The avoidant begins to realize that insight is not the same as repair. Awareness is not the same as reconnection, and intention, no matter how genuine, does not erase lived emotional impact. This is often the moment where the emotional weight deepens significantly, because they are no longer just reflecting on what they did, they are confronting the limits of what can be undone. And that realization can feel like standing in front of something they finally understand clearly, only to discover that understanding alone cannot bring it back. As this awareness grows, guilt starts becoming more present than ever before, and surprisingly, it often hits harder than rejection itself. Rejection is something many avoidants are familiar with in one form or another. It can be compartmentalized, it can be rationalized, it can be turned into distance, into logic, into emotional detachment. But guilt is different. Guilt does not require another person to be present. It lives internally. It follows them into silence. It appears in moments of stillness. It surfaces without warning, and unlike